Let us begin then, if we may, please, Nancy, with your latest book, Love Thy Body. What is Love Thy Body principally about?
In Love Thy Body, I address, from a Christian perspective, a number of the cutting edge moral issues of our day, from abortion, euthanasia, to homosexuality and transgenderism, and so on. And my goal is to show that the secular ethic that underlies all of these different issues actually rests on a very low view of the body, which is why it's called Love Thy Body, and that the Christian view actually rests on a very high view of the significance and value and meaning of the body. And this is surprising to most people, including most Christians, because even most Christians think that Christianity has a tendency to be anti this world, anti-body, anti this world, that this world doesn't really matter very much, that all that counts is getting to the next world, getting to heaven. And that's not true. In fact, as we go into more detail, I'll be able to show you that, in fact, the Christian ethic affirms the dignity and value of the human body. And this gives us a different way to argue with our secular friends and neighbors, because we're not on the defensive then. We're able to show that Christianity actually communicates a very high view of the body, and we can craft a very positive message as a result.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think it's so obviously counterintuitive, but I think you make the case really well. And from my own experience in teaching a lot of secular young children and stuff, I try to get them out of the complacency that they have about the self-evident superiority of their own worldview, and as if it has its high view of the body and so on, as if it's self-evidently true and good. That your books have been really helpful, actually. So you actually say that secular liberalism destroys human rights if it's played out. Can you give us some examples, maybe starting with one of the popular issues that you've discussed, abortion, and how that plays out?
Right, abortion is a pretty obvious example. Now, what people don't realize is that today most secular bioethicists agree that life begins at conception. That's really not an issue anymore. In the public realm, sometimes people don't know that yet. But if you talk to professional bioethicists, nobody denies that the fetus is human from conception. So how do they get around that in order to support abortion? Well, what they say is, well, the fetus is human. It is biologically human, physiologically human, genetically human, but at a certain point it becomes a person. And as long as it's only human, it doesn't have any rights. It has no warrant for legal protection. It has no moral standing, and it can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be used for research and experiments. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, like Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. I've read articles, papers in the professional literature, and that's exactly how they describe it. They describe the fetus as medical waste. But at some point then it becomes a person, usually defined in terms of some sort of cognitive functioning, some sort of mental awareness, self-awareness. And at that point, it acquires some kind of status that we want to protect it legally. But look at what it's saying. That argument is essentially saying that as long as the fetus is merely human, it has no human rights. So being human is no longer enough for human rights. At some point, it becomes a person, and only then does it have rights. So that's why I say it essentially destroys human rights. This reasoning says that if you're only human, you have no right to legal protection. It's only if you qualify for some additional standing, you have to earn the right to legal protection by acquiring the status of being a person. And of course, the problem with this is that if you divide personhood from being biologically human, what do you base personhood on? It becomes very arbitrary. And if you read the literature among professional bioethicists, they all disagree on when a fetus becomes a person, because if it's not related to something biological, biology is something scientific, it's observable, it's empirically testable, it's objective. If it's not based on biology, what is it based on? It ends up being based purely on the bioethicist's private, personal convictions, and therefore it's totally arbitrary, and they all draw the line at a different place. So abortion is a good example of being able to show that even when someone is acknowledged as being human, biologically human, that is no longer seen as the basis for human rights. And that's why I argue in the book that the secular view actually destroys human rights, and it takes a Christian understanding to support human rights.
Excellent. Thank you, Nancy. I think, so it's interesting whenever you hear, say, atheists who do understand the loss that they experience by rejecting Christianity. You have people like Douglas Murray, or I don't think he's atheist, but Tom Holland, the historian too, talks about Christianity's implicit effects on our culture. But yet then the more logical in a way, I think, if you accept some of these premises, you say there's such debate, but if you accept some of those Darwinian materialist premises, then Peter Singer, as you talk about in the book, his worldview makes more sense, and it's maybe important for Christians to know people like that. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think we should definitely be reading the secular thinkers, and like Peter Singer, of course, I do quote him in my book, because he was the person, actually, for people who don't know him, he's a bioethicist at Princeton University. And he was perhaps the first person to really write in a very articulate manner, that personhood is separate from biological humanity, from being biologically human. He explicitly says that being biologically human does not earn you any human rights. It does not earn you any legal protection. I go over some of his writings in my class. I make my students do this. A close analysis of Peter Singer's arguments, and of course he applies it to other areas too, like infanticide. He argues that if personhood is based on certain cognitive functioning, well, how much cognitive functioning does a newborn have? Not much more than a fetus. He actually argues that personhood is a gray area, as he puts it, is a gray area up to 3 years of age, because how much cognitive awareness does a toddler have? So he's willing to allow that that parents can decide whether to kill their child, to be blunt. He thinks parents should have the right to kill their child even after birth. The reasoning being that some birth defects don't show up until after birth. And so parents should have the right to wait a while after birth and see whether the child is completely healthy. And if he's not, then they have the right to end his life. So yeah, Peter Singer is, I'm glad you brought him up, because a lot of Christians still think the debate is over whether the fetus is human. And they will argue with their secular friends that the fetus is human, it's alive, it's human life. People like Peter Singer, who are really on the cutting edge, are now arguing, so what? So what if the fetus is human? It's not yet a person. And so that is really where the debate is now. And in my book, Love Thy Body, I help people to understand, how to sort of catch up with where our culture is now and the nature of the debate.
I know, I'm so grateful for it. Thank you for helping us understand it. And even Singer too, whenever he will say that animals have personhood in some cases, whenever certain human beings don't, which is so counterintuitive, but I guess necessary to know in this kind of cultural climate. You also mentioned euthanasia then on the other end. How is euthanasia driven by the same dehumanizing worldview?
Right, well, let me respond to the animal rights issue first that you
Sure.
just raised, because some people raise that as an argument against what I say in my book, Love Thy Body. They will say, well, look, if animals can have rights, doesn't that contradict your argument that merely being biologically human there's not enough for rights because these animals are biologically, they're being recognized as biologically subject to certain human rights. The answer is it's really the same argument. As long as you are going to base personhood on cognitive ability, what Peter Singer argues is that some animals have higher cognitive ability than some humans. So it's really the same argument. It's still saying, I don't care about who or what you are biologically. All I care about is your cognitive functioning. And in that case, he would argue that dolphins and dogs and pigs have more cognitive functioning than a human newborn. So it doesn't contradict my argument, it actually reinforces it, that what Peter Singer and other bioethicists do is they say the human body doesn't matter, biology doesn't matter. It gives you no rights, no dignity, no basis for legal protection. All that matters is your mind, which they address as personhood. What matters is mental abilities. And so the arguments for animal rights actually fall into the same category. They're saying the animal has higher level of mental abilities than some humans, whether newborns or whether older people, like you raised the issue of euthanasia. So older people, it's the same argument, because what they're, in the case of euthanasia, what they're saying is, if personhood rests on a certain level of mental ability, then if you lose certain levels of cognitive functioning, you are no longer a person, even though you're obviously still human. Biologically, you're still a human being. But if you lose certain cognitive functioning, then you no longer qualify as a person and have no right to legal protection. And at that point, you can be unplugged. Your food and water can be discontinued. Your medical treatment can be stopped, and your organs can be harvested. So that's why it's such a significant thing. It has concrete, practical implications for how we treat people, and how we treat people when they do start to decline mentally. So it's the same reasoning, whether it's animal rights, whether it's abortion, whether it's euthanasia. It's all about the denigration of the body and saying just being biologically human doesn't cut it, doesn't give you any dignity, doesn't give your life any significance. It's just your mental abilities. And that's why I argue throughout the book that the Christian view is we're integrated wholes. We're integrated beings, mind and body, and that our body also has significance. It's God's handiwork. It has value. It has meaning. We are meant to take our identity from our body as well as from our minds. Some people have said, well, haven't you over-exaggerated the body? No, the point is you have to argue against the secular world at the point where they're making the argument. And where they're making the argument right now is your body does not matter. And it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. I pulled out an article for today from the Wall Street Journal. Here in the U.S., the most recent Supreme Court decision was June 15, 2020. And it was a transgender case. And the court essentially enunciated a philosophy of what it means to be human. And it said, anyone who identifies as a woman is a woman, regardless of their biology. So it's, in essence, it was embracing the same worldview that says your biology doesn't count, it doesn't matter, it's not part of your authentic self. So now it's written into law in the US that the body is not an important part of who you are, it's not part of your authentic identity. So this is where the secular world is right now, and that's what we have to counter right at the point where it's making a claim that's contrary to the Christian view of the human person.
Excellent. Thank you, Nancy. I think also you mentioned homosexuality, obviously, but it might be less obvious to people. What is the tie-in with the issue of homosexuality with this downgrading of the body? And perhaps you could tell us about the character Sean that you mentioned in the book.
Right. That's one of my favorite stories. people need to know that the book is not just a moral argumentation. That has lots of stories, lots of personal stories. And now that I teach at HBU, I have lots of stories from my students. And so, Sean, well, I'll tell you the reasoning first, and then I'll give you Sean's story. Even my secular friends agree that if you're speaking biologically, physiologically, in terms of genes and chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. So if you embrace a same-sex identity, you're essentially denying that design. You're saying, why should my body have any say in my sexual orientation? Why should my biological sex as male or female have any impact on my moral decisions about how I'm going to live out my sexuality? We have to help people realize that's a profoundly disrespectful view of the body. And so once again, it's the Christian view that actually says, no, we value, we honor your body. We are meant to take our identity in part from the body that God gave us. So Sean was a young man. I tell his story in this chapter on homosexuality, and he always identified as exclusively attracted to the same sex. And the interesting thing about his story, Mark, is that he was raised in a gay affirming family and attended a gay affirming church. So he never thought there was anything wrong with being homosexual. Today he is married to a woman. You have to say that, married to a woman, and has 3 children. And so what changed for Sean? Sean says, I stopped taking my identity from my sexual feelings and started to take my identity from my body. He says, I wasn't trying to change my feelings directly, which rarely works. He said, instead, I decided to take my identity from what I already had, and that was a male body, and to treat it as a good gift from God, as he puts it. And he said, eventually my feelings started to follow suit. So what he was saying was, I recognized that God had given me a male body, and that this was intended to teach me something about who I was, because what God creates is good, right? The fall, the Christian worldview is often said to fall into like three acts. It's a 3-act drama. The first act is creation, where God creates everything good, and he says so in Genesis. After the creation of male and female, in fact, it says it's very good. So God was pretty excited about the division into male and female. Then we have the fall into sin, and sin distorts and distracts from what God originally created. But it doesn't completely obliterate the beauty and goodness of creation. And redemption is not just about personally getting saved. I mean, that's the first step. The first step is accepting Jesus as your Savior and understanding that Christianity is true. But that's not what it means entirely. It also means working with God to be a redemptive force in society through the rest of your life. Otherwise, if you don't know that, you say, well, I got saved, and then what do I do now? Just wait around to die.
Yeah.
And go to heaven. But if you understand that redemption is meant to be this ongoing work with God in terms of bringing God's truth into your society and pushing back on the lies of the secular worldviews, then you realize redemption is an ongoing task of, as C.S. Lewis once put it, Satan has taken, we're in occupied territory. Satan has taken charge, and we're pushing back against the occupation. At any rate, what we have to realize is that male and female are part of God's original creation, and therefore good. It's fundamentally good. And even though it's been distorted by sin and by false worldviews, nonetheless, the division into male and female is something we should embrace and honor. So Sean, by the way, Sean the young man we're talking about, is now a Christian ethics professor
Wonderful.
in London. Yeah, yeah, he's Sean Doherty is his full name. But his point was that he says, I came to realize that my body should be honored. I should honor my body. I should live in accord with the Creator's design. I should live in, I should honor the person that God has made me to be. And so one of the biggest tasks I find in talking to Christian audiences is the only language they have for these issues tends to be fairly negative. You know, don't do it. It's a sin. It's wrong, and there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
If you do it. Whereas in my book, Love Thy Body, I give people the language to say the Christian ethic is about honoring our body as a good gift from God, as Sean put it. It's about living in accord with the design that God created. It's living in it's living in harmony with it. There's another story that I tell. It's about a young woman, and her name was Jean. But Jean lived as a lesbian for many years and converted to Christianity. And eventually, it took a while, but eventually she's now married to a man and has 2 children. And the way she puts it was this: I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason. And I decided I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. No, that's the language we need to use. Honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. This is how you make a positive case for the Christian ethic.
Wonderful. I think that comes across in your earlier books too, especially Total Truth, that whole vision of the good life that we as Christians are called to. It's so refreshing to actually read that. And recently I spoke with J.P. Moreland, and he argued similarly that Jesus is primarily, well, arguably a virtue ethicist more than just about rules. It was obviously both, I suppose, in philosophical terms, deontological as well, but that we should put the emphasis on the call to virtue and living a good life. And God's purpose for us is to flourish, as you're suggesting there, if that's fair to say.
And let me give you the other side so that you really understand that this is actually how secular people do argue for homosexuality. In other words, they do argue for dismissing and denigrating the body. The clearest example I found was a lesbian named Camille Paglia.
Mm-hmm.
You may know her, yeah. She's a well-known public intellectual, and one reason she's so well-known is that although she's a feminist and a lesbian, she does not agree with the standard feminist view that that sex and gender are just social constructions. She says, no. They're biologically based. Nature made us male and female. Humans are a sexually reproducing species. So then you ask, how does she defend being a lesbian then? And she says, literally, this is a direct quote. First of all, she says, nature made us male and female, but why not defy nature? And those are her exact words. And then she says, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute right to our body and may do with it as we see fit. So do you catch the logic there? Essentially, she's saying, if our bodies are a product of mindless, meaningless, purposeless forces, then our body has no intrinsic purpose that we are obligated to respect. Instead, we may do with them as we see fit. So this is where the Christian worldview, again, it helps when we contrast it with the secular worldview, we sometimes understand our own worldview better. So this would be a good example where the secular worldview says your body has no intrinsic purpose. You can do with it whatever you want. The Christian would say, no, God created the universe with a design, a plan, a purpose, an order. And when we live in accord with that order, that purpose, we are going to be happier and healthier. And after all, even science shows that living things are created for a purpose, that eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, fins are made for swimming, and wings are made for flying. In fact, the development of the entire organism is directed by a built-in plan or blueprint. It's called the DNA code. So even science itself confirms the idea that we're made for a purpose. And that's really what Christians are arguing when we come to these moral issues. You know, it's just not just a matter of, like you were saying, do this, don't do that. It ties into an entire worldview. And at issue is this, the core issue is, are we products of blind, purposeless forces? Or are we the products of a loving creator who had us in mind, as one scientist put it, who had us in mind when he created us? And therefore, we do want to honor the body as part of God's good creation. We need to bring people back to these bigger worldview issues so they don't reduce it to just, like you said, just rules. It's not just rules, and particularly for young people, because young people, they want to know the reason behind the rules. If you just give them rules, it's not going to stick. You need to show how the rules reflect this much broader and this very positive, life-affirming Christian worldview.
Marvelous. I think that all comes across in the transgender issue now, and we see even the struggles between transgender people versus older feminists and stuff, like Talia and different, what do you call her, lady from, I can't remember the podcast. It'll maybe come to me after. But you draw in Love Thy Body some interesting links between things like transgenderism and the environmental movement. What is going on there in that particular cross-section?
Let me start by saying that transgenderism is the clearest example of separating the body from the person. Because transgender activists themselves argue that your gender has nothing to do with your biology, that your biology is not part of your authentic self. There's a BBC documentary on the subject that says at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body, at war. I mean, this is severe alienation. This is severe, you know, this disintegration of the body from the person. So that now kids down to kindergarten are being taught that their body is not part of their authentic self. There's a lawsuit currently going on here in the US where a woman's, in a family, there's a first grader, 6 years old. And she comes home and says, "Mom, am I a boy or a girl?" Because her teacher had been teaching that just because you have girl parts does not mean you're a girl, and just because you have boy parts does not mean you're a boy. And she was quite distressed at not knowing her identity. And so she literally said to her mom, "Please take me to a doctor so we can find out what I am." And I think it's a good thing that the parents are taking this to court, saying, you know, you're causing my daughter distress, mental and emotional distress. So these days, kids are being taught that your body is not important, it's not significant, it tells you nothing about who you are, it's completely irrelevant. And the first question Christians should be raising is, why accept such a negative view, such a devaluation of the body? And even secular people are starting to see this. I read an interview with a 14-year-old girl and who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years. She had transitioned at age 11, and then at age 14 recovered her identity as a girl. And she said in this interview, the turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body. And this interview came out after my book. So it's not included in the book, but it would be a great quote to have in a book titled Love Thy Body. And this is on a very secular, very liberal website. And what it shows, though, is even secular people are starting to say that transgenderism is a form of body hatred. You start to seeing that these days. Transgenderism is a form of body hatred. And in fact, there was another website by a woman who, what was her ages? I think she transitioned at about age 15 to male, and then detransitioned at 19. So she spent about 4 years living as a trans boy. And she said when she transitioned to boy, she got all kinds of celebration, all kinds of support. Everybody told her how brave she was and how wonderful it was that she had discovered her authentic self, et cetera, et cetera. All sorts of instant friends. But when she detransitioned, she lost all those friends, and she was viciously attacked. And so she wrote this blog in which she said, you know, what would I say to having gone through this, what would I say to a young woman who is questioning her identity? And here's how she put it. And she, again, a very secular person, it's very clear from her writings. And she said, if I could get just one young woman to love her body, all of the attacks I've suffered will be worth it. So you see, secular people are catching on that this is a matter of respecting your body, which is what, I mean, my book, there it is. My book, Love Thy Body, came out about 2 years ago. And it's kind of interesting that it came out ahead of all of this. And now secular people are catching up to the idea that all of these issues rest on respecting who you are, your biological sex. You'll see transgender websites, for example, that actually say the phrase biological sex is a hate term and you are not allowed to use it. So they're trying to erase the very phrase biological sex from our vocabulary. Now you drew the connection to the environmental movement, so I want to be sure to address that. This one was actually kind of surprising to me because I didn't spend a lot of time on it in my book, Love Thy Body, but in talking to people since then, you know, wider audience, the book comes out, you get a wider audience. I have found that this argument is perhaps the most persuasive in both secular and Christian contexts. Basically, what we've learned from the environmental movement is that to avoid pollution and ecological disasters, we need to respect the structure of nature. It doesn't mean you can't intervene, but when you do intervene, you need to work with the natural order, not against it. We may not do as we see fit, to use that phrase from Camille Paglia, when it comes to the environment. And in the same way, what Christians are saying is that we should respect our own biological nature. That the correspondence between male and female is not some evolutionary accident, but that is part of the original creation that God pronounced very good. So if we phrase it that way, what I have found at least is that even Christians say, okay, now this makes sense. That what you're saying is we work with our body, we don't work against it. If I know that I'm female, then my sexual orientation and my gender identity should be in harmony with that. It should be in accord with that. And if it's not, you know, then I want to work on it. I don't just say, oh, well, it's okay to have that kind of dislocation, that sort of, you know, disconnection. The person who's best known as the founder of queer theory is Judith Butler. And that's her argument. She says there's no natural connection between your biological sex, your sexual orientation, and your gender identity. She's a lesbian, so she wants there to be a disconnect. But then as a result, she basically takes her experience as normative and says all of us of you are wrong. There is no natural connection. Her word is we need to denaturalize. That's her word. We need to denaturalize the idea that there's any natural connection. And so essentially what people like Judith Butler are promoting is an incredibly fragmented and disconnected view of the human being. And that I'm arguing that that's not healthy. Even Judith Butler acknowledges that most of us actually want to have that inner coherence Most of us like the idea that there's some sort of integration of our biology and our emotions and our identity. And basically she paints herself as the bearer of bad news, like, sorry guys, you may want to have that natural integration, but it's not natural.
Yeah.
And Christianity is saying, yes, it is natural. God made us to be integrated beings, whole beings, so that we experience that inner harmony and integration. So that's how we need to present it to well, both in the church and to our secular friends.
Beautiful. I think that's the double blessing of your book. So it's prophetic in that more positive sense. And then my fear is, as you say, that it's ahead of the secular culture since it came out 2 years ago. Then you say some things in there that do cause me great concern. So whenever you talk about transgenderism and how to be able to define, so that's, I was thinking of Christina Hoff Sommers earlier, by the way, and all these feminists who are at war with transgender people and the whole attack on J.K. Rowling and stuff in the popular culture. So if we don't know and we aren't able to define what a woman is, then we can't have women's rights, as you say in the book, and same with children's rights and so on. That's the scary point for me. And then how is that going to be legislated? And then how you speak about a lot of these people don't believe in, say, God-given rights or a natural law or natural rights as it's developed in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I guess. So they think that the authority falls to the modern nation state to decide how we should legislate these things. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I think that's really important and kind of frightening in a way on the darker side. But then you also offer the beautiful Christian anthropology that we should be adhering to and offering to the culture, which would help us to get back on track, I hope.
Yeah, let me address the feminist, the contrast or the conflict really between the feminist movement and the transgender movement. Now, most feminists, in terms of sheer numbers, go along with the transgender movement. You know, if you define something as rights, they'll say, "Oh yeah, we're for it." Mm-hmm. But there are a large number of feminists who are beginning to realize that the transgender agenda is undermining women's rights. If anyone can claim to be a woman, regardless of their biology, then the word woman no longer has any meaning. Or at best, you might say it has purely subjective meaning, you know, whatever my personal feelings are. If I feel like a woman, you know, there's no objective standard. And that does threaten women's rights legally, because then you cannot have protective spaces that are just for women. In other words, as you know, bathrooms, it's the bathroom bills. It's the bathrooms, it's the women's shelters, it's the rape centers, and so on, are now being forced by law to accept male-bodied people who identify as women. But the bigger issue is, let me back up and show how the denigration or the dismissal of the body plays a role legally in all of the issues that we've talked about so far. So take abortion, for example. Like I said, everyone acknowledges that the fetus is human. So when the law allows for abortion, what it's saying is being human doesn't matter. That all that counts is what some bioethicist somewhere says is a person. Well, obviously, eventually it will be the state itself that decides who's a person. You know, whoever has the most power ends up deciding. Mm-hmm. And so people don't realize yet that when the law decides that abortion is okay, when abortion is legalized, essentially we've just said being human is not the basis of human rights anymore. And that's going to affect everybody. We're all human. And so you and I have not fully, and most of our audience has not fully assimilated the import of this. Basically, the law has said, if you're human, you don't have any human rights. We still think we do. We don't. We do not, technically speaking, we do not have any rights based on just being a member of the human race. Historically, you had rights. These are sometimes called pre-political rights, because the idea was that the state doesn't make them up, that you have them just because you're a member of the human race. So the right to life was seen as one of those very fundamental pre-political rights. The state doesn't invent this right. The state merely recognizes that it's a right you already have. And so essentially we've lost the pre-political sense of human rights. So then you go on to, okay, let's take marriage. Marriage has always been seen as a pre-political right, in the sense that human beings naturally come together and form families. And, the state doesn't create that. The state can regulate it, like, what your age has to be and so on. But the state doesn't create marriage. But in order to legalize same-sex marriage, the state had to treat opposite-sex marriage the same as same-sex marriage. And the only way you can do that is by saying biology doesn't matter. Now, being male and female is biological. And as long as marriage was based on biology, it was a pre-political right. Now, when the state legalized it in the US, of course, that was the Obergefell decision, the state essentially said marriage is not related to biology, it's related purely to feelings. And so again, it's that split between the body and your mind or your feelings. And the state has now said the only thing that matters is your feelings, is the mind, not the body. Or parenthood. Parenthood has always been seen as a pre-political right because it follows naturally from marriage. And it's true that in cases where a child doesn't have parents, you could have the state can step in and help out with adoption. But adoption was seen as modeled on the biological model of parenthood. But and same-sex couples could, up until recently, 2017 actually here in the States, up until recently, same-sex parents were not put on the birth certificate. The biological parent was, but the same-sex parent was not, because they had no biological connection to the child. I mean, if you have two women or two men, at least one of them is not related to the child biologically. But same-sex advocates argued that we want the same rights as a biological couple. And for the state to treat a same-sex parent the same as opposite-sex parents, once again, it had to deny the relevance of biology. If you can be a parent without being biologically related, then the state is essentially saying biology doesn't matter. It has no legal significance. And so now there was a 2017 Supreme Court decision here in the States that said, as long as you're legally married, you automatically are on the birth certificate as a parent, even if you don't have any biological connection to this child. Mm-hmm. So one thing after another is essentially putting the law. Mm-hmm. Oh, transgender, I skipped transgender. Transgenderism, same thing. Basically, if the law is going to treat a trans woman, that is somebody who's biologically male, the same as a biological woman, they have to say biology doesn't matter. All that matters is your internal sense of identity. And by the way, this is all now set in stone in terms of Supreme Court decisions. The decision I referred to earlier, which was just in June, basically said that. So now we have at the level of the Supreme Court, we have abortion, homosexual marriage, and transgenderism all saying that your body has no legal significance on the entire nation. And it's a philosophy that says your body is legally insignificant, and we do not recognize who you are biologically as male or female.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, terrible, but excellent that you point that out. I think it's so important. And the way, even as you suggest, it's phrased geared towards autonomy, and it's presented in such a powerful way that people get taken in. I saw this recently too with the Black Lives Matter movement, which kind of talks about the village, the wider village raising the child and so on. But I suspect from the way that's structured that they really mean that the state should intrude upon the natural family, and they're trying to present it in a manner that's going to appeal to people. And then I guess in California too, with the decision recently about pederasty with adults within 10 years older of a child now can't be put on the sex offenders register or something like that. Say if they're 11 and 21, that's not something that they have to go into the register for. I guess it all ties together with this notion of autonomy and separating the body, because you don't have even the sense of biological difference between the child in that instance and the adult, if that's fair to say.
Oh yeah, that's a good application. I wanted to go back to what you said about feminists, just because I'm on a group. There's a group called Hands Across the Aisle, and we have formed out of very conservative Christian women and lesbian, socialist, radical, leftist, women's liberationists. In fact, many of them are members of a group called Women's Liberation Front. So that kind of tells you. And we have come together over the trans issue, which is it's fascinating, actually working together with women who are in many ways so different, but these are the TERFs. Have you heard that term? The TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist, which is a term that's being used as a slur. It's used in a derogatory sense of feminists who are opposed to the transgender movement. But these are the feminists who realize that if you lose our definition of woman as based in biology, you no longer have a category that you can defend. You said it earlier. If you can't define a category, you cannot give them rights. You cannot defend their rights. So if we cannot define what a woman is, we cannot have women's rights. And you're seeing it even in the language. In medical literature now, you don't say women, you say people with uteruses. Yeah. Have you seen this?
Yeah, unfortunately.
And you can still have men, but you can't have women anymore. I mean, the language itself, even midwife organizations are starting to drop the word women. The idea being that some people with uteruses identify as men. Right? These are trans men. So these are women who are biologically women, but identify as men, and therefore we cannot talk about women when we talk about birth and pregnancy and breastfeeding and so on. And you have to call it chest feeding, by the way.
It's beyond parody at this stage.
Well, yeah, except they are taking it very seriously, and so that's why we have groups like the one I'm a member of, Hands Across the Aisle, where Christian women are linking up with the TERFs, with the very radical liberal feminists, in order to see if we can work together to defend women's rights.
Well, I'm very grateful that you're out there doing that good work, Nancy, and your book was a real eye-opener, and I do believe that Christians, secularists, all can gain a lot from your work. Both Love Thy Body and earlier works, I've gained so much, and I really appreciate it. Just before we close up then this evening, is there anything else that you're working on at the moment, or that you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I laugh a little bit because my next book is going to be equally controversial. I'm doing a book on toxic masculinity. Wow. And it's in a good enough form now that I'm actually doing some reading groups on it. I have my graduate students are going through the book, the manuscript, and students from the Honors College here at Houston Baptist University are going through it. So I'm really trying to take on, the idea that masculinity itself is bad and is toxic and is harmful. And I quote several psychologists saying that the men coming into their practice now are so beaten down and so emasculated and so full of shame. Here's how one of my students put it last week, and I thought this was a good way of putting it. She said, we hear all the time in the media about women's problems, about sexism and misogyny and discrimination, but men still are in the most positions of power in the government, in business, and so on. And so we tend to think the men are okay. And the facts are that men are not okay. Men are falling behind in a number of areas. I don't know if you know this, but men are falling out, just dropping out of the workforce. They don't show up in the numbers because they're not even registered in the unemployment rolls. That they're not tracked anymore. So, but in America, at least, men's work rates are at Depression era levels. They're that low. More men die on the job. More men die of heart attacks, drug abuse, and so on. And here's the one that was actually kind of perhaps the most surprising to me, was that boys are falling behind in education at all levels, from kindergarten through elementary school, through high school, and college, and even graduate school and professional schools like law schools. More women than men are getting PhDs. The numbers are striking. Women are really pulling ahead, and boys and men are falling behind. So I would like to address the problem of what's going wrong with our boys.
Excellent.
That's the next book.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're writing that, and I really look forward to reading it. And I'd highly commend all of your books to anybody out there. Thank you very much for joining me today, Nancy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me. I enjoyed it.